Hey there, today on Big Al Books, I'm here to do my June wrap-up. So you might remember from the start of the month, I posted a TBR video, and I was talking about how I wanted to challenge myself in two ways this month. So the first thing I wanted to do was to try the 30 books in 30 days reading challenge. And the second thing I wanted to do was to only focus on reading Indigenous authors throughout the entire month, because in Canada, June is National Indigenous History Month. And I'm happy to report back that I was successful with my challenge, and I actually read more than 30 books this month. I think the end total was somewhere around 42 or something, which every time I count, it just doesn't seem right, because I don't think I've ever read that much in one month. Don't worry, a lot of these books are on the shorter side. So I'm very excited to share all of what I've read this month, but also I'm intimidated because I don't know really how to cover that many books in one video. So I thought what I'd do is start this video off by talking about why I really enjoyed doing this reading challenge and what I learned and how I grew as a reader and as a person. And then I thought I would share 5 essential books with you. These were the 5 books that were true standouts for me, and I think anyone who's interested in reading more Indigenous authors should consider checking these ones out. So that way, depending on your interest with Indigenous literature, you can just stick around for the first part of the video where we talk about essentials, or if you are trying to decolonize your bookshelves and are looking for some more recommendations, then please stick around for the full length of this video. So let's start off by talking about why I really enjoyed doing this reading challenge throughout the month of June. So the most valuable thing about trying to read so many books in one month was that I had the opportunity to experience a wide plurality of voices. Because I think sometimes in the media, Indigenous people can be kind of represented in a very simplistic way. There's a phenomenon that people talk about called pan-Indianism, which is making it seem like all Indigenous people share the same kind of culture and they have a similar history and they all want the same things going forward in the future. And of course, that's just not the case. In Canada alone, there are hundreds of different nations, each of them with their own distinct history and cultural practices. And it was so rewarding this month to get to read from authors that had such different backgrounds. So I really liked how you got to see how each author had their own personal, unique perspective, but also they'd share some things about their own culture. And it was really cool getting to learn what made each of these nations very distinct, but then also seeing some of the shared similarities that were coming up between books. So that really helped widen my perspective, I think, and it was so great to get to read from so many authors from all over Turtle Island. The second reason why I love this challenge was I felt like I gained a deeper understanding of the texts because I was thinking about Indigenous perspectives throughout the entire month. So it wasn't just something that I thought about one weekend and then it didn't come up again, but rather it was my focus for a whole month, which I felt was really helpful in order for me to broaden my mind. And then that relates to the third reason why I loved this challenge, is that I was able to find connections between the texts, which was really powerful. Because I was reading a lot of nonfiction throughout the month, I thought it was incredible how so many of the concepts that I was learning about in the nonfiction would then apply to the fictional stories, which helped me connect with that in a deeper kind of way. So again, reading so many things was a powerful experience because I was just finding all of these links, and it just gave me a more broader understanding than just reading one thing in isolation. Then my fourth reason for loving this challenge is it introduced me to so many new voices, which is very exciting, but it also gave me the opportunity to return to some of my old favorites and build a deeper connection with them. You know, there are some authors that you just have a really strong bond with, and it can be hard to make the time to going back through their back catalog, and I found it really wonderful because I've been reading mostly Indigenous literature in June now for the past 3 years. It's almost like a tradition. You go back to certain authors in the month of June, check out a new book by them, and kind of strengthen that connection that you have with that author. And then my final reason for why I thought this was such a valuable reading experience was because reading all of these Indigenous voices helped me think more critically about current events that were being portrayed in the media and a lot of the discussions that people around the world were having about racism and systemic oppression and police brutality. These are topics that are so closely linked to colonization, and they were coming coming up in a lot of the books, particularly with police brutality. I noticed in a lot of the texts that I read that were by Indigenous women, that was something that was being mentioned. Sometimes it was a casual reference, but it was clear to see that there's a long history of tension between police forces and the RCMP and Indigenous people. So it was kind of sad in a way because, you know, I'd be reading a book from like the 1970s that was mentioning these issues and you're just kind of like, why haven't we fixed this yet? It was kind of frustrating in that way. But what I found the most powerful about all of these books that I read is that so many of them contain so much hope, and there are so many inspiring visions of the future. And that was one of my big takeaways from this month, is how we're never going to be able to challenge the status quo until we're able to envision a better future where everyone is able to flourish. And I think so many of these books did a good job of doing that. Even though a lot of these books are dealing with some highly complex issues, I do find myself feeling somewhat optimistic at the end of the month, and I think that is because there is just so much generosity in these books, and I learned so much from other people's cultural traditions and their traditional knowledge, and it just makes me feel like there are so many brilliant visions of the future. It was inspiring to get a glimpse of some of them, and it has really motivated me as a settler to do more work in my everyday life to try to transform Canada into a better country. So with that being said, I'm going to step off my soapbox and let's actually start talking about some books. In a surprising twist for me, 4 out of my 5 favorite books this month were nonfiction, and one of them is a novel. And I think what connects all of these books together is that idea that I was mentioning earlier of just being a really brilliant re-envisioning of what the future could be. So one of the books that does a brilliant job with that is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Now, I've only ever heard people say wonderful things about this book after they've finished reading it, so I think it's one that has a really wide range of appeal, and I think part of that is just the really gentle and generous tone that Robin Wall Kimmerer uses throughout. So even though this book is kind of challenging and provocative, she wants the reader to reshift their relationship with the planet, but she does it in like this beautiful, gentle, poetic kind of way, and I found that to be so persuasive and so powerful. So she's basically observing how in a lot of Western capitalist societies, the earth is kind of treated as this big resource that we can just continue to take from to make our lives better. But as we've been noticing over time, there are consequences to these kind of actions, and it's not great long term. So she proposes that our view with the natural world should be one of reciprocity, because there are so many gifts that nature provides us with. Like, there are so many things that are just truly beautiful that don't really need to be beautiful. I think she gives so many examples in this book, but like, for example, flowers, and like how vibrant and colorful they are, and why certain groups of flowers grow together. Like, there are so many ways that nature works to make our life better, and we really should be honoring that, respecting that gift, and learning how to say thank you back to nature, because it's not okay to just keep taking and taking and taking, but rather there are ways that we as humans can make the natural world flourish and become a more prosperous kind of place for everyone. So I loved everything about this book. I also think that this is a great read for anyone who does care about the environment, but doesn't want to be preached at for a whole book, because she is not here to like shame you and make you feel bad for your choices, but I think she also inspires you to want to do better. Like, really, this book was a game changer for me. I think I was like on day 3 of reading it that I was already going outside at night and like saying thank you to the trees. So I thought this was a really powerful read, and it was just a beautiful reading experience. Like, every chapter in this just felt like a gift. So I'm so grateful to have read that book this month. Then next on my list of essential reads is Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Anishinaabe Recreation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, who is one of my favorite authors. And this is a book that is like so slim but so powerful. So that's why I think a lot of people should read it, because it won't take you that much time, but I think it is able to offer so much in terms of teaching about this concept of cultural resurgence. So basically how Indigenous communities can be working together to connect to their roots, apply it to a present day setting, and work towards envisioning a better future in a Canadian context. So this is a book that I would really want to shove in the hands of every cynical Canadian who's like, there's no way to go forward with this. Like, Leanne Simpson has so many brilliant ideas in this book, and again, it's short. Now, one thing that I find very cool about Leanne Simpson's nonfiction is the way that she's able to write on so many different levels. So in some ways, this book is very theoretical and academic, and it's heavily sourced with lots of different ideas, but also it's deeply rooted in her community and her perspective as a Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabe person. I also like how she consults with elders throughout this book. You really will come away from this book with a better understanding of Anishinaabe culture because she includes so much of the language in this book and cultural teachings. But then I also like how she then applies it to her own personal life. So you get to learn about how this connects to her choices as a mother. There's a chapter in here on breastfeeding. So there is so much wisdom and inspiration contained in this small little volume. So I really do recommend that everyone should check that one out if they can. And then my third essential read was Memory Serves by Lee Maracle. This is a collection of oratories, and this is a mind-blowing book if you want to learn more about the oral tradition. So I think if you're someone who cares about the power of stories and language, then you're going to learn a lot from this collection. Because I think sometimes within the Western tradition, the oral tradition is viewed as something that's a bit more like simple and basic for cultures that didn't have any other advanced way of preserving their stories, but actually Lee Maracle breaks down just how complex the art of remembering a story is. It's not something that you just do for fun and games, but rather it is a role with a lot of responsibilities. And I think that was one of the big differences that I learned about the differences between the oral tradition and the literary written tradition, is that the written word is kind of more about expressing your own individual ideas and opinions, whereas the oral tradition is much more connected to this idea of community. Because you can't really tell your story without having an active audience to listen to that story, and it sounds like the process is much more active and participatory because you have to change your story each time that you tell it. You have to know your audience, you have to know what you're trying to teach them about life, and that is just a very active process, whereas reading and writing is very private. You're shaping these ideas in your own mind, but it's not really reinforced with what your community thinks. So again, that's just one of the insights that I gained from reading this book, but there were so many interesting ideas explored in here. Each chapter of this was just incredible. All of the chapters are based on different oratories that Lee Maracle has delivered herself, and then she worked really hard in the editing process to kind of set them down on paper. So yeah, this was again just another mind-expanding kind of read. Then my fourth essential book that I read this month was Shapes of Native Nonfiction, Collected Essays by Contemporary Writers. This was edited by Elissa, Washuta, and Theresa Warburton. This collection is invaluable because it introduced me to so many new up-and-coming writers. So there are so many people in here that impressed me, and I have to look up their work now, and I will be keeping track of what they're going to do in the future. But I also think that this is an essential project because of the way it's trying to redefine people's expectations and understandings of Indigenous literature. So the foreword to this collection kind of talks about how a lot of the times Indigenous authors aren't really appreciated on a literary level in terms of the craft of their writing. Rather, Indigenous authors are read because of their own personal experiences. So it's kind of more like being appreciated on an anthropological level rather than on this level of craft, which is really disrespectful when you think about it. So this collection wanted to correct people's understanding by choosing essays that are all formally complex and are doing really creative things with the structure of the essay. And it's not just about cannibalizing someone's experience and their trauma and their pain, but rather it's about seeing how people can share these stories in really creative ways in the nonfiction form. So that was awesome, and so many of the essays in here were really cool, so I do really highly recommend that one. And then finally, my favorite novel that I read this month was called Shell Shaker, and this is by Leanne Howe. And this one actually didn't appear on my original TBR video because it was a last minute buy for me. So right before the month started, I ended up rereading Why Indigenous Literatures Matter by Daniel Heath Justice. I read this for the first time last year, but I wanted to refresh in my memory some of the concepts that he shares in this book. This is also an essential read, I think, if you are trying to get more into Indigenous literature, or if you're looking to like deepen your perspective, this is an outstanding resource. And I also love how he recommends so many cool books throughout his text, and one of them that he wrote about was Shell Shaker, and it just sounded too cool to pass up, so I tried to last minute order it so I could read it in June, and I'm so glad that I did, because this book was brilliant. You can definitely trust Daniel's word on that. I guess you could say that this book is an intergenerational family story, since it's set in these two different historical eras. But what I think is unique about this book is it's not just about how like the past has an influence on the members of the family in the present day, but rather it's about how the past is like actually repeating itself. Like they're kind of living the same story as their ancestors in a way that they are their ancestors. So there was a very neat spiritual element to this book, and I think it was executed brilliantly. So there's a lot of crime in this novel, a lot of violent events are happening, so in that way it's very thrilling and intense. Right at the start of the book, in the scene set in the 1700s, you have a mother who's decided to sacrifice herself because her daughter's been accused of murdering this other lady in another tribe, and she wants to prevent the tribes from going to war against each other. So that introduction is really intense. And then you go into the 1990s, and this chief of this tribe has been murdered, and this girl again is accused of being responsible for this crime. So lots of intensity with the plot. It is a novel that will keep you engaged and interested all the way through. And I also really enjoyed getting to know the characters in this story. I really liked how they worked together to try to solve the mysteries that were happening in the text. Like each person had their own essential role, and I really loved watching them work together and like having to use their own strengths to try to figure out a solution to this like really intense spiritual problem. So this is a great book to check out if you are looking for a gripping and powerful read. So those 5 books were my real standouts from throughout the month. I hope you'll consider checking out some of them. But I did also read so many other amazing books, so I'm going to go on now in this video and talk about everything else that I read. I'm going to break this up into some sections so you can kind of skip around as needed, but first we're going to start off talking about more nonfiction, then we're going to get into novels, and then we'll wrap things up with some poetry and graphic novels. So to start off, I read 2 memoirs this month. One of them was Nîtîsanak by Lindsay Nixon, and the other was Bobbi Lee, Indian Rebel by Lee Maracle. And I think these 2 pair really nicely together, even though they were written very many years apart from each other. And I feel like these novels really go well together because they're just very gritty and raw and upfront. And I really respected that about both of them. I don't think the authors of either of these books are trying to sugarcoat their experiences. They're very upfront about the discrimination that they've faced and some of the challenges that they've gone through, but they're not really trying to go through those challenges in kind of a gratuitous kind of way. Especially Nîtîsanak, I think, is very upfront about how the author is not trying to share their pain with the reader in like a trauma porn kind of way. And I really liked how Lindsay Nixon challenged the reader's expectations on that, and they would just straight up skip over scenes that in most memoirs would be these really large events that you go into in great detail, but they would just be like, we're not going to talk about that, you don't need to know that. And I think that that's really cool memoirists who are very selective about what they share and what's appropriate for the reader to know. So I really valued that. I also really enjoyed Lindsay Nixon's informal tone throughout this book. This documents growing up on the prairies and getting involved in the punk scenes and the queer communities, and finding out that neither of those communities were as inclusive and welcoming as they were expecting them to be, because they're kind of these communities that are made up of outsiders. And even still, there are different ways that people judge each other or don't share space or privilege or access. So I thought that this was a really unique exploration of that. So it's definitely worth checking out if you're looking for that kind of unconventional, unfiltered memoir. Same goes with Bobbi Lee, Indian Rebel by Lee Maracle. This is just a memoir that is very raw and real. And it's very interesting to see Lee Maracle's writing from an earlier part of her career, because I think I'm more familiar familiar with her work from this later part of her career, and the way that I see her is as this like really like respectable, knowledgeable elder who's just like full of wisdom, and this is like a completely different view of a different period of her life. And it's fascinating to watch her kind of grow and change throughout this memoir. Even this memoir itself, the last 40 pages are written at a later period than the first part of the memoir, and Aaliyah's already starting to like change her thoughts and feel like she's a different person than the one she portrayed in the earlier part of the memoir. So I think it's just really valuable to learn about how people can grow and change. So even though she came from this difficult background and really didn't have a great experience with the education system, she was still able to find ways to educate herself throughout her life and through the people that she met, and she starts getting involved in these kind of social justice movements. So it was really cool getting to watch that kind of growth. Although I think this book is dated in a few kind of ways. I think it wouldn't meet today's standard for like politically correct language, but still I think it's a really important document for its time period. I also read The Truth About Stories by Thomas King, and this isn't a memoir, but I feel like it did get deeply personal in some of the chapters of this book. So this is Thomas King's reflection on the art of telling stories, why people do it as humans, and how it can kind of change us and our worldview. So not only just the stories that we tell each other about interpreting our own history and our culture, but also like your very personal history. I appreciated getting King's insight into stories because I think he's such an engaging storyteller himself. He has this very like dry, kind of dark sometimes sense of humor, and he's just always entertaining, whether he's taking on creation myths or going through historical incidents or the portrayal and representation of Indigenous people in the media. And I really like how he would end each chapter by saying, "Don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now." Next up, I have Tsawalk, a Nuu-chah-nulth Worldview by E. Richard Atleo. The Nuu-chah-nulth people live on Vancouver Island, and I actually, you can tell from my bookmark here, I was able to buy this book when I was visiting Vancouver Island, and it is probably my favorite place on the planet. So it was so cool to me reading this book to kind of get a glimpse of how the original inhabitants of that place view reality in a way that is very different than what I am accustomed to thinking about. And I think that that's what's so cool about reading books by people from other cultures, because it can just be a very mind-opening experience to just see how people think differently and have different thoughts about life and everything that goes beyond it. So this is a very spiritual book, and ultimately the principle of Tsawalk is this idea of oneness, or everything being connected, which the author links in the introduction to a lot of the recent discoveries that are being made in quantum physics, how you can't really understand parts of the universe in isolation. Rather, everything kind of depends on its context and how it's connected to everything else, which is very much in alignment with the Nuu-chah-nulth worldview. So it was very cool learning about this worldview, and I also liked how Atleo used traditional teachings from his culture, and then he'd analyze them in great detail to kind of explain what you can learn about his interpretation from reality from them. So this was a really fascinating and mind-opening read. I'm very excited because I also have another book that's called Principles of Tsawalk, so I'm hoping that this one was kind of the introduction, and that one will go into some more depth about this philosophy. Then I have 3 nonfiction books that were kind of more political in nature. One of them was called The Truth That Wampum Tells, My Debwewin on the Algonquin Land Claims Process by Lynn Gehl. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I think that this is one that I enjoyed reading, but it is a very specific kind of read. So if you're thinking about picking this one up, know that it gets very specific about this land claim process in a way that maybe isn't going to be interesting for the general reader. But what I did really love about this book is the way that Lynn was explaining how her thinking and her learning shifted throughout her journey. And something that came up in quite a few of the books I read by Indigenous authors is this idea of learning and understanding things using your whole being. So instead of just knowing something in your mind, you also have to know it in your body, your heart, and your spirit. And I think this book does a good job of how Lynn developed her understanding in her mind and in her heart. She's very clear and specific. The the kind of things that she did to shift her understanding, whether that was doing academic research or whether that was going to community meetings and getting involved in the process herself. So it was really cool how she shared that journey. And I also think that the Algonquin land claim process is something that needs to be considered and understood by more Canadians, especially since the capital city of Canada, Ottawa, is currently located on unceded Algonquin territory. So for some reason or another, there was just never a treaty that was made, and it's still very much up in the air about what's going to happen with this land. So I did really enjoy learning more about the Algonquin people and their history, and then how that connected to Lynn's own experience. I also read Peace, Power, Righteousness, an Indigenous Manifesto by Taiaiake Alfred, and this just seems like a very influential foundational text because I saw this book being mentioned in quite a few of the other nonfiction books that I read. And basically, this book is directed at First Nations communities, and he's arguing that real meaningful change is never going to happen from the outside. So you can't really count on the Canadian government to really ever want to change the colonial relationship, even though they might say that they're interested in doing that on the surface. Rather, the change has to come from within. And that change can only happen if you are living in a community that is really connected with your own culture and your language and your land. It's very similar to some of the ideas explored in Dancing on Our Turtle's Back from Leanne Simpson. She writes from an Anishinaabe perspective, but he is writing from a Haudenosaunee perspective. So it was kind of cool to get two takes on this kind of cultural resurgence, but from two different cultural backgrounds. I also liked how Alfred used the structure of a traditional ceremony called the condolence ceremony as a way to share his ideas throughout this book. And I also like how he brought in other voices. So he was interviewing other scholars and activists to include their ideas and to back up the arguments that he was making. So this is a good one to check out if you're interested in that whole process of self-determination and what that can look like. Another book that closely connects to that topic is Redskin White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition by Glen Sean Coulthard, and he is from the Yellowknives Dene people. So this book, again, was highly referencing Dancing on the Turtle's Back and Peace, Power, Righteousness. So it's really cool how these books are all referring to each other. And I think this book also develops the idea that these two do, that real meaningful change and resurgence needs to come from within a culture. It's never going to happen from the outside, and you can't really rely on the Canadian government and getting them to acknowledge you and, recognize your self-government. It's not really going to be meaningful change because that is just not in the best interest of the colonizer. And this one gets pretty heavy into some theory, especially he's looking at a lot of Frantz Fanon's work. So I would say that this one is probably the most heavily academic out of these three kind of political books. But I also appreciate how he was able to connect that theory with some present day examples, especially he was looking at the Idle No More movement as a case study. So it was really great getting to read these three books in combination with each other because I think they all helped shift my understanding of the self-determination movement. So I would recommend all three in combination if you can get your hands on them. And finally, the last nonfiction book I read was The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Truer. And I thought I was pretty lucky to find a copy of this at a used bookstore since this is still a pretty fairly new release. And this book was written in response to the classic text Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. That book goes through a lot of the strategies that the US government used in the 1800s to dispossess First Nations people of their land, and it is a really upsetting and disturbing kind of book. But David Truer's issue with that book is that it basically presents Indigenous peoples as being wiped out by the end of the 1800s, which of course is not the case. I thought it was really cool that he was inspired to write this book in order to challenge that kind of depressing narrative, and he wanted to show how much resilience there is in so many Indigenous cultures and how they're still a very important part of the fabric of American society. So I loved the idea of this book and why it exists. I don't think that I was the biggest fan of the execution of this book because it's not just kind of a straight up history narrative, but rather David Truer brings in a lot of his own personal experiences, and he's a journalist as well, so he's interviewing people, which was kind of a neat way to connect the history that you'd learn about to the present day. But I just thought that more of the book was taken up by these kind of interviews than it was actually going in depth about some of these like important moments from history. I also thought the section on the present was maybe shorter than I was expecting. I thought there was going to be more information there, but again, that's just kind of my own expectations. I also noticed that most of the people that he was interviewing were predominantly men, so I just felt like there were maybe perspectives in this book that weren't explored as fully as they could have been. So I thought this was an okay read, but it wasn't quite as mind-blowing as I was hoping it was going to be. So that's it for all the nonfiction that I read in June. If you're wondering why I look different now, it's because I got pretty hungry while I was filming, so I took a break to make lunch and then I lost all of my momentum and I decided to finish this video on a different day, and today is that day. So let's move on with this video by discussing some of the novels that I read this month. I think I read about 10 novels and also one fantasy trilogy. So I'm going to talk about the novels in my order from favorite to least favorite. So my favorite novel of the month was Shell Shocker by Leanne Howe, which I've already talked about in more detail at the start of this video, but again, I just want to remind you that this exists and it's a really great story. Then my next favorite was actually a reread for me, and that's Raven Song by Maracle. This was one of the first novels that I picked up when I was starting to get more interested in reading books by Indigenous authors, so it was really cool to return to this because even though I loved it the first time around, I feel like I can appreciate it on a much deeper level, especially since I've read so much Maracle since I read this the first time, so I feel like I kind of understand more what she's trying to do with her craft and with the purpose of this story, and I think it's just an all-around excellent tale. It's a coming-of-age story about a girl named Stacy, and she lives in a First Nations community in British Columbia, but she has to go to high school in the other part of town, which is more of a white community, and this book is kind of all about her trying to navigate these two different societies and looking at the culture and her trying to like make her way in both of these worlds. It's great how this novel is able to challenge so many conventionalities of settler society. Sometimes it's really funny and playful and it will have you laughing. Other times it gets much darker and more serious, especially when an epidemic hits the town and Stacy is noticing the First Nations community is affected so much more severely by this epidemic. And she's also noticing that there's this disturbing amount of apathy from the people in the settler part of town where they have access to so many more resources, but they don't really seem to care about helping out more. So that causes a lot of conflict and tension for her. And I felt like that really rings true to a lot of settlers today in Canada, where a lot of people know that there are some pretty serious issues that First Nations communities are dealing with, but even though Canada has the resources to fix a lot of these issues, you can tell that it's just not a priority for a lot of people. So I think this book is still very relevant to today's situation, especially rereading it during this pandemic. So I'm really glad that I revisited this one. And then the next novel that I really enjoyed was Five Little Indians by Michelle Good. This is a debut novel, and it's telling the story of 5 residential school survivors. So each of these 5 individuals experienced a lot of trauma while they were away at this residential school, and this is kind of following their story of what happens next. One thing that I think is really insightful about this novel is how for every character, their trauma will manifest in a different kind of way. So you can see their behaviors and their actions and their choices are all going to be different based on their relationship to the past, and I kind of like that. It's not like a one-size-fits-all. They're all dealing with things in their own kind of way, and that's going to have different impacts on their behaviors. I can say that the characters in this were all very lovingly drawn. They felt like real people, and you grow really attached to them, like right away. Even if they don't make the best choices all the time, you are always rooting for them, and you just want them to be okay in the end. And that's another thing that I like about this book, is that it's not just about trauma and suffering. I really appreciate how Michelle Good was able to depict the difficulties that her characters were experiencing, while also still focusing on the moments of joy and success and connection. This is really about the friendships and the relationships they're able to build together, to like finding community and working together to find a way forward. And I think that that's an essential part of the conversation, because residential school survivors are so much more than just victims, but rather stories like this really highlight how much strength and resilience these characters have, and I thought that that made for a very beautiful novel. Next up, I have a few novels by authors who I've already read before in the past, but it was really enjoyable to go back to them and discover more of their back catalog. One of those authors was Louise Erdrich, and this was her novel Tracks. I've yet to be disappointed by a Louise Erdrich novel because she just has this poetic prose style. She creates these compelling, well-crafted characters, and it really doesn't matter at what time period her books are set or who they're about. She is always able to just draw you into the story and make you interested in learning more. Tracks is set in North Dakota in the 1800s, and it's told in two different narrative points of view, and it alternates between those voices between chapters. My favorite of the narrators was an older man named Nanapush, and I thought he made for a fascinating narrator because he has just experienced so much change throughout his life. Because when he was younger, he was basically living an independent life with no interference from the US government or settlers, but gradually things start to really change for him in his life. His land is allotted. All of a sudden, he's expected to pay property taxes, which is really difficult if you are someone that makes their living from the land. You're not really participating in that money economy in the same way. So it was pretty fascinating getting to see those kind of big changes happening from more of a personal perspective. And then the second narrator of this book is a woman named Pauline, and she just has a very different story because she is not really proud of her Indigenous identity. She joins up with the church, and she is basically trying to erase that part of herself to fit in to settler society. She has a lot of bitterness, a lot of issues. She is kind of a strange, warped woman who causes a lot of conflict in the book. So I think it was a great choice for Erdrich to use both of these narrators to tell the story because they are just such different people and they have a really different way of seeing the world from each other. So it was cool that you're kind of getting this story from such opposite points of view. So I think this book was a great work of historical fiction, especially because the story was being told in this really creative and compelling kind of way. Next up is Keeper and Me by Richard Wagamese, and I read this entire book within a 24-hour span, so I can refer you to my 24-hour readathon vlog if you want to hear more of my thoughts about this one. But I thought this book was just such a tender depiction of Ojibwe culture. It's told from the perspective of a character who was taken away from his family and put in the foster care system. So he kind of grows up not really knowing about his cultural identity, and the person that we meet at the start of the story is just lost. However, quite early on in this novel, he's able to reconnect with his birth family and he decides to go to their reservation in northern Ontario. And this whole book is like a joyful exploration of how he's able to find himself by getting in touch with his Ojibwe culture. I've seen quite a few negative reviews of this book on Goodreads where readers were frustrated by the lack of plot. And I think that's heightened because there's kind of a lack of conflict. It's not really a story about struggling and suffering. It is, like I mentioned, it's just a very joyful tale about reclaiming his culture. So maybe that's something to keep in mind if you are a plot kind of reader, but I do think that this book is really worth reading because it contains so much wonderful wisdom about Anishinaabe philosophy and culture in here, so it's a great resource for that purpose. And I also found it quite refreshing to get to read a feel-good story about Indigenous characters. Since so many other narratives are kind of dealing with more difficult subjects, it's nice every once in a while to get to read a happier book that is all about celebrating culture. So I still think this one is worth checking out. Then I was also able to read two novels by Thomas King this month. One of them was his debut novel, Medicine River, and the other one was Truth and Bright Water. I enjoyed both of these, but I think I slightly preferred Medicine River. I'm not really sure why, because a lot less happens in this book, but there was just something charming about it. It's about a guy named Will who returns back to his hometown for his mother's funeral, and basically there's this kind of like nosy community member named Harlan Big Bear, and Harlan basically convinces Will to move back to town to open up a photography shop, and it's kind of about the adventures that ensues when he moves back. And Harlan was just a really great character. He's kind of annoying, and he's always snooping around in other people's business, but he just has this heart of gold, and I thought he was just kind of a funny character to follow around. So yeah, like I mentioned, like nothing big happens in this book, but it's just a loving comical portrayal of just a quirky small town, and I liked it. Then his other novel that I read, Truth and Brightwater, it's a bit more of a coming-of-age tale about one summer in the life of this boy who witnesses something very strange while he's hanging out with his friend, and throughout the summer they're trying to figure out what it was exactly that they saw, and then their two lives just end up going in these completely different directions. So one thing that really struck me with this book is how this book is dealing with a lot of intense things and emotionally difficult situations, but the narrative tone is always very light. I'm not really sure if I liked that stylistic choice. In some ways, I think it makes sense for like this male teenage narrator. He doesn't really get vulnerable with the reader and he keeps everything on the surface. So I guess it was kind of appropriate for his voice, but on the other hand, it kind of felt like the story didn't go deeply enough into the issues that it's presenting, and it kind of kept things at more of a superficial level. So maybe that was my own problem with reading this book. I enjoyed this book well enough while I was reading it, but I feel like the ending just lacked the emotional intensity that I think it deserved. So while typically I enjoy Thomas King's style, I don't think that this was one of my favorites of his novels. Next up is The Way of Thorn and Thunder by Daniel Heath Justice. This is an Indigenous epic fantasy trilogy. I read the first book in this series, Kinship, maybe about 2 years ago, and I thought it was fine, but I just never continued on with the series. So I'm glad that I returned back to this world and finally finished it, because I thought that these books were a lot of fun, especially if you are a reader who is into epic fantasy and you're looking for more diverse takes on fantasy stories. These books gave me classic fantasy adventure vibes like you'd find in Lord of the Rings, but the tale is also heavily allegorical and it's about colonization. And what I think is cool about this project is it's kind of like asking the question, what might have happened if these different people and groups came together to try to more actively resist colonization? And I think that that's a really creative thought experiment. So I found this to be quite an engaging story to follow throughout the whole trilogy. I will say that I don't think the prose style was my favorite in this series. There are a lot of scenes where you're jumping around between characters and locations, and a lot of those transitions seemed kind of clunky and jarring. So it wasn't like the smoothest construction of stories, but I still think it's a cool one to check out if you're looking to diversify your fantasy reading. You know, not only does this take Indigenous perspectives into mind, but also there was a lot of diversity in terms of sexuality and gender identity. So it was very cool watching Daniel Heath Justice develop this kind of diverse, inclusive imagination of a fantasy world. And then I read 3 more novels, but I didn't really enjoy these ones, so I don't want to talk about them too much, but I still do want to mention them because just because I didn't like them doesn't mean that you won't find something worthwhile in them. So the first one of these was Crow Winter by Karen McBride. This is a debut novel that just kind of feels like a debut, you know, where it's just like a young author trying to find their footing. This is about a girl named Hazel who finishes university and moves back home to her reservation. She's living with her mom, but things are kind of tough because her dad has died recently, and of course everyone is still feeling a lot of grief about it. But then she also notices that strange things are happening in her community, and she starts investigating this land claim deal from the past. And then there's also a sort of spiritual, supernatural feel to this book when the classic trickster figure Nanabush shows up to help her solve these mysteries from the past. So I would say my main issue with this book is that the plot doesn't really get going until like halfway through, so you have like 150 pages to read of like very little happening. My other issue with this book is that the narrative voice read like YA, but the pacing and the plotting didn't really match that of a YA novel. So there's just kind of a discrepancy, I guess. So it was written in that like classic YA first person. The narrator is kind of this chosen one, special person, but she doesn't realize that about herself. She thinks that she's just kind of clumsy and awkward, and I just didn't love the voice that I was seeing in this book. But it's still a cool book if you want to check it out and learn a bit more about Algonquin land claims and some of the issues surrounding that. Next up is Bloodsports by Eden Robinson. This book is kind of unique because out of all the novels that I read this month, I think this was the only one that didn't deal with Indigenous characters. This is actually this gritty urban thriller that is apparently a Hansel and Gretel retelling. I read that at the back of the book, but I didn't quite pick up on it while I was reading the story. And it's kind of centered around the story of these two cousins that have this kind of twisted, sadistic relationship with each other. And actually, I think Eden Robinson had written about these two cousins in a short story of hers from her collection Traplines. So I kind of already knew the characters in this. However, I think the short story did a better job of depicting their relationship than this one did. I just felt there was kind of something lacking about this one, because with a thriller, it's all about like the payoff at the end, right? You go through a lot of suspense and intensity, and you really want it to build up to something spectacular, and I feel like this book didn't have that kind of shocking payoff. So that's why I don't really think that this one is an outstanding read. It's kind of fun when you're in it in the moment, but it just didn't build up to anything impressive. The last of these books was The Girl Who Grew a Galaxy by Cherie Demeline. She's a lot more well known for her YA dystopian book called The Marrow Thieves. So this is one of her earlier novels. And this is one of those novels that could have been a really cool short story, but the story just didn't seem to work when it was stretched out over the course of hundreds of pages. So it's about a girl named Ruby Bloom who has a tragic incident happen in her childhood, and all of a sudden these stars and planets start spinning around her head, and they're basically a physical manifestation of her anxieties and her mental insecurities or whatever. So I liked that element of magical realism in the story as this girl walks around with this big galaxy constantly following her around, but I didn't really like the route that the story went. It got kind of predictable as, you know, Ruby is working to overcome her anxieties and try to make the galaxy disappear so that she can live a more normal life. There was also a really long romance section in this book where she travels to New Orleans and like meets this guy who's like too good to be true, and they fall in love instantly, and I'm just not a romance reader myself, so that section of the book was quite hard to get through for me. So yeah, this one just didn't really work for me. It could have been a cool 10-page short story, but I definitely didn't need a novel fleshing out the story in this much detail. And then to wrap up this video, I want to quickly mention the short story collections, plays, poetry collections, and graphic novels that I read this month. I'm going to have to go through them kind of quickly because I feel like this video is already super long. So if you want any more information about these, you can of course ask me about it in the comments. But for short story collections, I have 3. One of them is technically a novella. This is called Midnight Sweat Lodge by Wabgashig Rice, but it kind of felt like a short story collection because it's about a group of people that get together in a sweat lodge, but they kind of tell their stories, and each of those stories makes up a separate chapter. This was a perfectly decent read, but I did read it one night in like one sitting, and it really hasn't stuck with me very much. I don't remember a lot about the stories because I just feel like there just wasn't enough time for them to get fully developed in more depth. So I would definitely be curious to check out this author, but this one didn't particularly leave much of a strong impression on me. Then I read 2 short story collections that were very different from each other. The first was One Good Story, That One by Thomas King, and these are just kind of cute and entertaining, funny short stories. They have engaging premises, and King always has like a weird, warped sense of humor, so I enjoyed seeing that in his stories. The Stone Collection by Kateri Akawenzi Dam is very different because, you know, this is more like comic and lighthearted, and these stories were definitely more intense emotionally. Each of these stories is like its own character study, and I was really impressed with how Kateri was able to draw you in quickly into each story and really flesh out who this person was that you were reading about. And a lot of these ones were kind of emotionally intense, but there were a few that were more fun or lighter hearted. So this was like a well-balanced collection. So these were both enjoyable, but for different reasons. Then I was also able to read 2 plays by Thompson Highway this month. One of them was a reread for me. This is his classic play called The Red Sisters, and this is about 7 women who have these dreams of attending this big bingo game in Toronto. They all have different visions for how they could change their lives with the money if they won the game, and it's also about their interpersonal relationships with each other. You know, they get into arguments, but they also have this emotional bond with each other, so I quite enjoyed looking at this one again for a second time. However, Then I also checked out the companion play, which is called Dry Lips Autumn Move to Kapuskasing. So this is a play that deals with women. This is a play that is set on the same reservation, but it is all about male characters, and I didn't like this one. This play just felt very messy and meandering, whereas in the Red Sisters, they at least have this common goal and they're trying to get to this bingo, but this play didn't really have anything that brought it all together in the same kind of way. I also thought that the characters came across as really sexist, and I didn't really enjoy how they interacted or talked about the female characters in their lives. And there was also a lot of hockey in this one, which again, is just not one of my favorite things. But I just did not enjoy the act of reading this play. Maybe it would be different if I saw a live production, but I would just recommend checking out the Red Sisters and then just stopping there. Throughout the month, I was also able to read 5 poetry collections, which is a lot for me, and I was impressed by all of these collections, but I think my favorite was Natalie Diaz's When My Brother Was an Aztec. The poems in this deal with a wide variety of subjects, but my favorites were the one that dealt with addiction, particularly what it's like to have a family member with a drug addiction. They were just very haunting and powerful. I also feel like there were quite a few of the poems in this collection that maybe went over my head because Diaz is kind of brilliant, so I didn't always get everything that was happening in these, but they were all very visceral and evocative, so I'm so glad I checked this one out. I also enjoyed Passage by Gwen Benaway. The title refers to passages in waterways, but also passages as being this personal journey. So in particular, this book is looking at trans identity and relationships and working through past traumas. There's also Witness I Am by Gregory Schofield. The first collection in this is particularly powerful. It takes on a Cree creation story, but then also addresses issues around missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Also, on a lighter note, there's a poem in here that describes making chicken soup, but it describes it as the most intense, violent, aggressive thing ever, and I just got a kick out of that one. Then there's Indian Coping Mechanisms, Notes from the Field by Billy Ray Belcourt. Belcourt's poems to me strike this great balance between being quite intellectual but also emotional, so he is a poet that will just get you thinking and feeling throughout his bold experimental poetry. And the final collection was Hope Matters. This is by Lee Maracle and her daughters, Kalumpa Bob and Tanya Carter. Even though this collection is written by a mother and her 2 daughters, each of these poets, of course, has their own unique voice. So I found this poetry collection was also a guessing game, because you could read the poem and then you had to really think and guess who the author was, which was revealed kind of subtly at the bottom of the page. But I really did like getting to familiarize myself with the voice of each of these poets, and this collection spans a wide variety of topics and subjects, so I think there's a little something in here for everyone. And then lastly, to talk about the graphic texts that I read this month, one of them was a children's picture book. This is called Hiawatha and the Peacemaker, and it was written by Robbie Robertson, who you might know as a musician, but this is based on a traditional story that is told by the Haudenosaunee people that he heard when he was growing up. He wanted to create some music to accompany this book, and the illustrations in here are done by David Shannon, and they are beautiful. So this is basically the story of how the Six Nations Confederacy was formed. It's about this guy here, the Peacemaker, who has this vision of the future, and he thinks that these nations need to put aside their difference and work together in alliance because they will be more powerful together than they would be alone. It makes for a great message for a children's story, but I also think this is something that adults would be interested in learning about as well, especially for North Americans. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy were very influential in terms of passing along ideas about how a democracy can work, so we really owe a lot to these people, so it's interesting to hear one of their origin stories. The next graphic novel series that I read is definitely not for children. This is the Wendy series by Walter Scott. I reread the first 2 volumes in this collection, and then I got to read the 3rd installment, which just came out in the month of June, and that is Wendy, Master of Art. So basically, Wendy follows the quarter-life crisis of a party girl who is also a struggling artist, and in this installation of the series, she decides to go back to school to get her master's degree. They call this the University of Hell, but it's actually based off of Guelph, which is in Ontario, and I thought this book was a really funny depiction of what it's like to study art in an academic institution, and sometimes how art gets so intellectualized that it kind of loses all of its meaning. But even though this book is kind of dealing with these kind of deep and heavy topics, it is just always funny and silly, and Wendy just makes a lot of sad mistakes. You know, she's trying to put her life together, but she never quite succeeds. So it was very interesting watching her engage with this world of academia, because that's quite different than the context that we saw her in earlier novels where she's kind of hanging out in these slummy areas of Montreal. So it has been fascinating watching her character arc over the series, but really I can't get enough of these comics. I think that they are just so much fun and worth checking out. And then lastly, I read two beautiful graphic novels by Michael Nikola-Yagulanis, and he calls his style of art Haida manga. So it's very influenced by his West Coast Haida culture, especially this one here, A Tale of Two Shamans. This is a traditional story that has been illustrated, and also the story is being told in 3 different West Coast Indigenous languages, and then there's just a small English translation here. So I thought that that was a really creative way to tell this story, because I imagine it would be slightly different in each language, but they're all able to connect through the graphic depiction of the story. But then my favorite of the books that I read by him was Carpe Fin, and it's about these fishermen who are struggling after there's been an oil spill near them. So they find themselves having to travel out further into the ocean and taking more risks to be able to find fish, and one of them makes a big mistake and he encounters this strange godlike being and chaos ensues. So yeah, I really liked how playful and chaotic the illustrations are in here. It was just a lot of fun to flip through, and I would definitely be interested in reading more by this author, because he is certainly doing his own thing with the genre of the graphic novel. So that was really cool to see. So that's it for all the books that I read in June for the 30 books in 30 days challenge. I'm sorry that this video is so long, but I thought it was really important to mention each of these books. I think that they're all worthwhile reads, and I love to be having this conversation with you here about Indigenous authors on BookTube. So please let me know if you're interested in checking out any of these books, and I will see you again sometime soon. Bye!